Rogue waves. For centuries, they've captured the public's imagination and terrified sailors. They have become the stuff of legends. But for a long time, rogue waves couldn't even be proven to actually exist. They sat firmly in the same category as krakens and giant whirlpools, as little more than seafarers' tales. But then, in the modern age, ships began to encounter huge waves seemingly out of nowhere at sea. Some of these encounters were even deadly, and some actually sank ships. Here are some terrifying true encounters with real-life rogue waves. In 1910, the Oceanliner Lusitania was battling its way through a very heavy sea in a storm. See, oceanliners aren't like cruise ships. When bad weather comes up, they can't just go around it. Like a city bus, they have to maintain a regular schedule. So if there's a storm, they have to go right through it. The Lusitania and its running mate, the Mauretania, were the two largest and most modern, luxurious ships afloat at the time. For passengers, they must have seemed like floating cities, almost 32,000 gross registered tons and 787 feet, or 240 meters long. Regardless of how big the ships were though, the ocean was mightier, and in heavy seas they would roll and pitch up and down in the big waves. In 1910, the US eastern seaboard was experiencing a very nasty winter snap, with a blizzard engulfing New York City, and at sea, things weren't much better. Lusitania was battling its way through 50-knot winds and a 30-foot or 9-meter swell. At about 6 p.m, the ship's captain, Turner, left the bridge to retire for the night, but he had scarcely stepped away when something was spotted ahead. It was a towering mountain of water, a monster wave that the ship's crew, 22 meters above the ocean, were looking at eye to eye. But then, as the wave was getting closer and the men on the bridge began to brace themselves, the Lusitania pitched downward into a trough and the wave reared up well above the ship. With enormous force, it smashed over the top of the bridge, totally engulfing the massive ocean liner in white water. The bridge windows smashed in immediately, and the men inside held on for dear life as seawater roared in and swept them off their feet. In fact, the bridge was flooded up to 5 feet or 150 centimeters. The wave smashed along Lusitania's length until it was left behind, and incredibly, the Lusitania continued on its way. Afterwards, the men on the bridge picked themselves up. The helmsman, who had been steering the ship, had been flung backwards into a wall and found that he was still holding the ship's wheel in his hands. It had just broken clean off its base. Then the men realized, to their horror, that a fellow officer had been standing on a compass platform way up above the bridge. Somehow he had held on, and even though he was about 8 or 9 stories above the ocean, his legs were swamped by the water. To him, it must have looked like the Lusitania was diving into the ocean, only to never return. But Lusitania did return. The ship continued on its way after being thoroughly checked and arrived in New York a few days later. The bridge windows had been shattered and the whole bridge front had been smashed backwards by about 2 inches or 5 centimeters. Not only that, but 4 of the ship's lifeboats, each securely tied down and weighing about a ton each, had been ripped away. Amazingly, there were no fatalities or injuries in this encounter, but for a moment there, it must have seemed like it was the end for Lusitania's passengers and crew. Fast forward 85 years to 1995, and the Queen Elizabeth II was in a very similar situation. Headed for New York at about 200 nautical miles, or 370 kilometers off Newfoundland, the ship ran smack into Hurricane Lewis. 1995 marked an extraordinarily active Atlantic hurricane season, and Lewis was a killer. 19 lost their lives when it made landfall, and about 20,000 were made homeless. At sea, huge waves were being whipped up by the insane wind speeds of the Category 4 storm, and Queen Elizabeth II was caught right in the middle of it. QE2, as it was affectionately known, was considerably bigger than Lusitania, over twice the size, but it didn't account for much because in the face of 40-foot waves and 130 mile per hour or 209 kilometer per hour winds, the ship pitched and rolled. Onboard shows were cancelled, blackjack tables in the casino were tipped over, and then, in the Grand Salon, almost 7 stories above the normal water level, windows were smashed in by massive waves. Just after 4 a.m. on September the 11th, QE2's captain, Ronald Warwick, was on the bridge when out of the darkness ahead he spotted some white cliffs. At first, he thought they even looked like the white cliffs of Dover. But then, To his horror, he and his officers realised they were staring eye to eye at a wave about 96 feet, or just shy of 30 metres tall. QE2 had its nose pointed straight at it. You don't want to be caught from the side by a giant wave, we'll see why later in this video. But the crew held their breath as the wave raced directly at them. Captain Warwick recalled that the wave seemed to take ages to arrive, but it was probably less than a minute before it broke with tremendous force over the bow. An incredible shudder went through the ship. Just like on the Lusitania, the wave broke directly over the ship's nose, a seething, boiling wall of white water which smashed into the ship's bow decks with all of nature's incredible destructive power. QE2 broke through this first wave, but then the 963-foot-long ship dropped down like a roller coaster car directly into the path of a second wave, which crashed along the ship's length. It was this second wave which smashed into the QE2's bow with enough force to rip heavy crew doors open, bend railings, and wrenched away the big whistle mast. Amazingly, because the captain had advised passengers to stay confined to their cabins in the face of the heavy seas, and because it was so early in the morning, nobody was hurt in the incident, as most of the nearly 3,000 aboard were tucked away safely in bed. For centuries, sailors who had encountered rogue waves like this weren't believed, or it was thought that they were simply embellishing their stories. But Warwick and his officers were vindicated in their story because a nearby Canadian weather buoy recorded an insane spike when it rode up and over a 98-foot or nearly 30-metre wave that same night. So far, the rogue waves we've looked at caused no serious injury and weren't deadly, and this one isn't either. But it very nearly was, and if things had played out just a little bit differently, it would have easily resulted in the largest loss of life in maritime history. It was the Queen Mary, owned by the same company as the Lusitania and QE2, the Cunard Line, which was one of the world's most beloved and largest passenger ships, coming in at around 81,000 gross registered tons and exceeding 1,000 feet, or 304 metres in length. In normal peacetime service, the Queen could carry about 2,100 passengers and 1,000 crew, but in the depths of the Second World War, it was realised that thousands more troops could be squeezed into the ship. Queen Mary, then the fastest ship in the world, was put into service as a troop transport, and the British government pushed it to its limits. At first, the Queen carried about 6,000 troops, but then as the war dragged on and more men were needed, it was scaled up in a big way. By 1942, the ship, along with its sister the Queen Elizabeth, was capable of carrying some 16,000 soldiers to Europe, an incredible number that, for a single vessel, has never been topped before or since. Cramming 16,000 men, the equivalent of an entire division, into a single ship was a bold move by the British. It was not an easily made decision. But incredibly, faith was put into the Queen Mary's speed to dodge and outrun enemy submarines and airplanes. Adolf Hitler even put a bounty on the Queen Mary, the equivalent of $250,000, and the coveted Iron Cross medal for whichever submarine captain could sink the ship. Bizarrely though, it was nature that nearly achieved this directive, and not Hitler's submarine fleets. In early December 1942, the Queen Mary was loaded with over 16,000 American GIs and set out from New York to Scotland, braving over 3,000 miles of U-boat-infested and stormy Atlantic Ocean. By the fourth day at sea, the conditions had worsened and the Queen was now facing massive seas and high winds. On top of carrying the 16,000 plus men, the ship had been loaded with equipment and supplies which, coupled with its low metacentric height, a topic I covered in my ship design fails video, caused the ship to roll slowly over to one side and never seem like it would return to level. The troops inside the ship had to suffer, and many had never been in such ocean conditions before. Seasickness was rife, and the inside of the ship became a nightmarish hell, awash with vomit, and with many men presenting to the infirmary with serious dehydration. Regardless, the Queen Mary ploughed on, cresting monstrous waves and smashing down stories at a time, only to be met by the next one. Just 700 miles from her destination, the ship crested a wave and dropped like she'd done 1,000 times before, but then, seemingly out of nowhere off the ship's port bow, there appeared an enormous rogue wave, at least twice the height of the biggest wave she'd yet encountered. The bridge tried to turn the ship's nose towards it, but it was too late, and the Queen Mary was caught plumb on its broadside. Windows across the ship and on the bridge shattered as water roared over it, and lifeboats on the side facing the wave were just ripped off their davits. The ship began to heel way over, 10 degrees, then 15, then 20, then 30, and then 40. By now, everybody inside, if standing, would have had to have held on, or at the very least have 1 foot on a bulkhead or wall. Then the list kept going, 45 degrees, and then an incredible, horrifying 50 degrees of list. Inside the ship, anything not bolted down raced across the interior and slammed against the starboard side. Men not holding on in their bunks were thrown down, suffering concussions and broken bones. Portholes smashed in, and seawater roared into cabins and staterooms. The starboard side of the ship slung low in the water so the lifeboats almost kissed the ocean surface. Then the ship stayed there, heeled hard over 50 degrees or so. For what seemed like an eternity, it stayed like that. It could only have been seconds, but for the 16,000 troops and 1,000 crew on board, it must have felt like forever. Nobody knew if the ship would roll to its doom. Incredibly, the ship began to slowly right itself, coming back level and putting everybody inside back onto their feet. It's been estimated that if the ship had rolled just a few more degrees, then it would have exceeded its center of gravity and completely rolled over, capsizing in a raging sea that would have certainly resulted in the death of every single person on board, instantly becoming the worst single maritime disaster in modern human history. The wave the Oceanliner Michelangelo encountered in 1966 was a deadly one, killing 3 people and injuring dozens more. SS Michelangelo was a liner built for the Italian line. Radical in its design, the ship was of decent size at about 49,000 gross registered tons and just over 900 feet or 276 meters long. The ship was used to maintain a regular passenger service to New York from Genoa, Italy, and just a year after its maiden voyage in 1965, the ship was making its way to New York when it was smashed by a rogue wave. The ship was 5 days into its voyage and had run into a storm. No problem though, because the ship was well designed to handle these kinds of conditions. Waves 20 meters high or 66 feet crashed over the ship's bow and it pitched up and down. But then, at a critical moment when the nose of the ship began to drop downwards, a huge wave appeared off its bow. Normally, this wave would have been harmlessly cut in two by the ship's knife-edge bow, but as the front of the ship dropped into a trough, the old storm wave reared up higher and higher until it was well above the Michelangelo's bow. At that second, when the ship was at its most vulnerable, the wave smashed down onto the front decks and plummeted into the forward superstructure. Tons and tons of water crashed home with terrifying violence. When the water had cleared and the Michelangelo came back up again, it became clear that something seriously bad had happened. Coming into the storm, the captain had ordered passengers to stay in their cabins, a smart move when the sea is so rough that unprepared people could be thrown around like rag dolls. But this also meant that all the cabins in the path of the wave were occupied, and when the spray had cleared away, the damage was revealed. The front of the ship's superstructure had simply collapsed, the metal caved in and bent like cardboard by the weight of the water. Cabin T11 at the very front of that section of the ship simply ceased to exist. 2 passengers in cabins at the front of the ship there were killed immediately, as was a crew member. Across the ship there were 50 injured, 10 of them gravely, from sprains to breaks and lacerations from falls. The ship rendezvoused with a US Coast Guard vessel whose personnel scrambled aboard to help the overloaded ship's doctors. Michelangelo limped into New York Harbor and the damage was assessed. At the time, ship's superstructures were being made entirely of aluminium to save weight and reap a speed benefit, but this meant the front of Michelangelo's superstructure could be easily caved in by enough water. It was rebuilt with steel instead. We end now on a ship whose loss remains a mystery to this day, but whose disappearance can likely be explained by rogue wave activity. The München, or Munich, was a modern cargo ship built for Hapag-Lloyd. It was designed to carry barges and effectively became a ship designed to ship other ships. The Munich was built in 1972 and was a 37,000 gross registered ton ship, about 857 or 261 meters long, somewhere in the size range of the Lusitania. In December 1978, the ship set off on a routine voyage from Bremerhaven in Germany for Savannah, Georgia in the USA. Since the month prior, a bad storm had been raging in the North Atlantic, so the Munich's crew knew, or thought they knew, what they were heading toward. The ship was thoroughly modern, very safe, and designed to handle the North Atlantic at its worst. That kind of ship, called an LASH carrier, is renowned for its flotation ability and was, at the time, considered to be practically unsinkable. Now, where have we heard that before? Munich set off into the storm, but it would never be seen again. At just past midnight on December the 11th, the ship's wireless operator was chatting with a friend on another ship and reported bad weather and even some mild damage to the Munich. Despite this, all seemed well and the ship continued on. But then, at 3 AM, things changed when garbled SOS calls were picked up by ships in the area. The conditions must have been playing havoc with the radio because little could be discerned except the Mayday call and the phrase 50 degrees starboard. This chilling detail takes us back to the Queen Mary, which also rolled over to 50 degrees but was able to right itself. Munich would not be so lucky. The ship's distress call seemed to stop and a search was initiated, but it was hampered by the bad weather. Through the next day, chilling radio signals were detected. One amateur radio operator overheard a voice in English but with a thick German accent. The signal was weak and garbled, but the operator heard Munich's name and call sign. Later that night, 10 more weak Mayday signals were received by a US station in Spain, again garbled but referring to 28 persons aboard. Munich had departed Germany with a crew of 28. That night, Munich's call sign, DEAT, was received by the same station and a Dutch tug. Next day, the wind speeds had dropped somewhat and a larger search could be put underway. 4 aircraft and 17 ships took part, and then they started to find things on the ocean. First, an empty life raft was recovered by the British freighter King George. Then Munich's fleetmate, the Hapag freighter Erlangen, found and identified 3 of the Munich's barges. Over the next few days, 3 emergency buoys, 3 life rafts, a barrel and 5 life vests were either sighted or recovered from the ocean, but they were all empty. On December 20, the search was formally called off, but the company Hapag and the West German government continued to search, being aided by some 80 other ships. On February 16th next year, a passing ship spotted a flooded, damaged lifeboat, and printed on it was the name München. This was the last thing ever seen of the ship. Investigators had very little to go on but that damaged lifeboat, with the block tackle still attached, but it told a very vivid story. Parts of the block's tackle, the pins usually hanging vertically, had been bent and twisted by some enormous force, enough to rip the lifeboat off its mountings entirely. At the time, the existence and occurrence of rogue waves was misunderstood, so the loss of the ship was put down to bad weather. But in time, the issue was revisited. All the evidence pointed to a horrifying fact, that Munich had been the victim of one or several rogue waves that night. As the ship battered its way through the storm, it likely plunged into a trough on the reverse side of a wave, just like Lusitania and Michelangelo had done. The wave would have smashed down onto the deck, torn the lifeboat off of its davits, and then ploughed into the bridge, smashing windows and possibly disabling the crew. Without steering or crew on the bridge, Munich may have drifted broadside into the storm waves and begun to list at an alarming angle. That distress call had mentioned 50 degrees to starboard. The ship floated this way, dead in the water for hours, being battered by waves as the crew inside clung on for their lives. But in the end, help could not arrive in time. Munich would have rolled, maybe even totally capsized, and flooded in short order. It was a horrifying end for the ship and her crew, and today, the Munich remains undiscovered, lying somewhere down there on the sea floor, a testament to the fearsome power of Mother Nature. Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. Thank you so much for watching this video. Please think about liking and subscribing to the channel. You can support my channel on Patreon. You'll find the link down in the description. Until then, stay safe, stay happy, and I'll see you again next time.